Inventory of attention. When Jonas was small, his mother would take him to the market each Saturday and let him pick one thing. Sometimes he chose a bright plastic toy that rattled. Sometimes a glossy comic book. Once, a paper windmill that spun when you blew on it. The rule was simple, one item. And that scarcity made each choice feel important. He learned early that wanting more than one felt unnecessary, and that wanting something else the next week did not mean the earlier joy was wasted. It only meant desire had its own fragile life. Years later, walking the same cobblestone streets as a young man, Jonas watched the city change. Storefronts gleamed with products he had never imagined as a child, phones that answered themselves, clothing branded with names that promised belonging, tiny machines that delivered coffee before you asked. For a while, the novelty was intoxicating. Each new object announced itself like a small triumph, a promise that a different version of himself would be happier, more complete. One autumn evening, as rain stitched silver down the windows of his apartment, Jonas opened a box he had ordered after months of saving. He expected a surge of delight. Instead, his hands moved through the unwrapping like a priest through ritual. The object was handsome and precise. It behaved exactly as advertised. He placed it on the shelf among other objects that had once answered similar promises. The satisfaction lasted like a match struck in the dark, bright, brief. Then nothing but the faint scent of smoke. That night he remembered the paper windmill. How the act of choosing made him connected, not to the object, but to the person he had been when he chose it. Desire, he began to see, was less about accumulation and more about the illusion that filling space will still the mind. The more he gathered, the more empty the gaps seemed to look. Jonas decided to leave for a while. He traded the hum of the city for a season in a quieter town where people measured time by the light on the hills and by how many loaves the baker left to cool on his windowsill. There, he found an old potter named Layla who shaped clay the way some people breathe, with rhythm and purpose. Her workshop smelled of damp earth and tea. Her hands were stained the color of the kiln. One afternoon, Jonas watched Layla press her thumbs into a lump of clay and coax a bowl from it. The clay resisted, surrendered, and then took form. Layla did not fuss over the finished work. She did not keep every piece she made. Some bowls were sold, some broken on the way home, some given freely to neighbors who needed a measure for soup. When Jonas asked why she gave away what she could sell, she laughed, wiped her hands, and said, "I do not own the clay. I only listen to it." Possession is a story people tell themselves when they forget how to be present. Jonas heard something there that his purchases could never teach him, the difference between collecting to fill a void and creating to give shape to an impulse. Layla's life was full but light. Full like a house that opens onto a garden instead of hoarding sunlight through closed shades. He realized that material desire had been his imagination's poor substitute for attention to other people, to craft, to the hours themselves. At the market, a woman handed Jonas a cracked cup she no longer wanted. It was imperfect, the glaze chipped, but in his hand it felt like proof of continuity. He walked home with it, not because he needed another object, but because it was a small story of someone else's life. For the first time in years, he felt the possibility that what mattered could be shared rather than kept. As seasons turned, Jonas began to journal. He wrote about mornings when the light made dust motes look like stars, about conversations where a single honest sentence cleared more confusion than a shelf of explanations. He wrote about the sensation of buying nothing and noticing everything, the way the river changed after rain, the cadence of a child's laughter, the quiet of someone repairing a bicycle. These notes were not lists of goals or shopping plans. They were inventories of attention. People he met called him a minimalist, ascetic, or eccentric depending on their own anxieties. Jonas shrugged. He had no desire to name himself. What shifted was not the number of items he owned, but the architecture of his wanting. He learned to differentiate between appetite and need. Appetite was noisy. Need was precise and rare. Appetite asked for evidence that he mattered. Need asked only for what allowed him to live well and to be present. One spring, a friend from the city visited and brought a suitcase of gifts, thoughtful objects, each tied with a ribbon. They spoke for hours. The friend asked Jonas if he ever regretted giving up certain things. Jonas thought about his mother's market rule and about the match of satisfaction from his earlier purchases. I regret only the moments I mistook having for living, he said. The objects I kept out of fear of losing my identity. Not because they were useful or beautiful to me now. I regret the time I let wanting dictate my days. His friend listened and then, with a half smile, confessed the opposite fear, that giving up things might mean losing memories. Jonas realized both fears were cousins. He set out to show that memory need not live inside objects alone. He retraced places, wrote names in the margins of his journals, and learned that stories could anchor him far better than anything bought to prove existence. Years later, people still asked Jonas for advice on how to live simply. He rarely offered rules. Instead, he described a practice. Begin each week by listing 3 things you will notice: a sound, an act of kindness, a changing light. Then, at the end of the week, write what those things taught you. He called it the inventory of attention. Over time, his friends reported a subtle, important change. Their homes did not become emptier. Their days became fuller. One evening, standing at the door of a community hall, Jonas watched neighbors gather to share food and small performances. Someone passed around the cracked cup he had once carried home. It moved from hand to hand, and each person spoke a memory evoked by the cup, a morning when their father taught them to stir batter, a rainy day when a stranger sheltered them under an umbrella, a song learned at a youth camp. The cup was broken and imperfect, but it had become an emblem not of owning but of belonging. Jonas understood then that to live well amid endless desire is not to deny appetite, but to teach it new literacy, to read without mistaking every sentence for truth, to recognize the difference between accumulation and affection, to celebrate arrivals without assuming they will fill every absence. The world would continue to glitter with things that promise completion. People would still chase the mirage. Yet there are other skills: listening, making, sharing, that offer a steadier contentment. He kept the practice simple. When he was tempted by something new, he would ask himself 2 questions. What story does this object help me tell? And am I already writing that story elsewhere? Often the answers revealed that the story he wanted was not one of possession, but of presence. In that realization, he found a durable kind of wealth, the ability to be fully awake in whatever season of life he inhabited, embracing the ebb and flow of beginnings, gains, and losses without treating them as final verdicts. And so Jonas's life continued, not as a ledger of acquisitions, but as a series of moments he recognized and returned to. He never stopped noticing that desire could be both creative and misleading. He learned to steward it without being owned by it. The city lights still glinted, and there were still temptations to chase. But he had traded the frantic pursuit of fullness for the quiet discipline of paying attention. In doing so, he discovered that to hold less in one's hands is often the clearest way to hold more of what matters.